As you'll see, basically, a lot of this research is based on
read speech,
which is
so
fairly clean.
text is underlined.
Yeah,
is hidden somewhere. Okay.
yes.
Well, since Kushal has a lot of materials to cover, so I think it's good to start. So we're happy to have Kushal here to talk about generative spoken language modeling from raw audio. Kushal right now is a senior staff applied scientist at Outreach, so working on conversational AI. And he was with Facebook AI Research, working on the topic that he's going to talk about. And so very looking forward to this. So Kushal, the stage is yours.
Oh, thank you. Hi, thank you for coming to the talk. And so I'm going to talk about generative spoken language modeling without text. This work spanned 3 papers over a course of 1 year. So I'll try my best to cover all of them. But the first one really laid the foundation of, what we want to do, what metrics we want to use, and that sort of opened up the work for the 2 papers. All right. So what's the overall motivation for the project? So we asked this question that NLP has benefited a lot from large corpus of textual representation, a large corpus of textual data that is available, almost freely available on the web. However, it's quite hard to find such corpus for speech. So we basically asked the question that can we build systems, especially NLP systems or language processing systems more specifically, without the need for text. And if we can do that, then we can exploit the signals in speech beyond just the linguistic content. And we can also basically think about languages which have very little textual resources or even no textual resources because there might not be a written script. So that was the main motivation that we started with. We also thought about the way infants learn, and that was another kind of grand motivation where infants are exposed to speech first and then written language, and then still learn to converse in the language. So there's definitely enough signal in speech to be able to build, to be able to learn how to have a conversation. So, and as I said, like we want to use this as a test field for language acquisition because there are so many languages that left out of the fold. And we also hypothesized that this will lead to better language understanding models beyond just what we have, because disentanglement of various spoken signals is going to be crucial if you want to make progress in this area. So the first paper in this series was simply generative spoken language modeling from raw audio. In this paper, we basically build a pipeline system based off a speech encoder, a language model, and a speech synthesis model. However, the main focus of the paper is to think about metrics, especially automatic metrics, because that is going to be a big hindrance if we want to make progress in this area. And I'm going to spend a significant amount of time on the metrics and how we thought about them. This is the overall pipeline. We have an encoder, and we take pre-trained speech models trained by self-supervised learning as our sort of example encoders, and then we learn a quantizer on top of it using k-means. The first task that we thought about was just discrete resynthesis, which means that the speech synthesizer or the decoder takes in these discrete learned units and tries to produce raw waveform. And then we added a language model, which we call a unit language model, because it's a language model trained on the learned units. And then we evaluate the system on the task of language generation. It's called speech generation, but really we can take the units and convert it into raw waveform, or if there were to be a translation model, we could even convert it to text. A bit more in detail. So the pre-trained model that we used for encoding speech are CPC, Wave2Vec 2.0, and Hubert. And For Wave2Vec 2.0, we use the large version. For Hubert, we use the base version. The reason for this discrepancy is that at the time, Hubert large wasn't available. And we take the dense representations, which are produced at a frame level, and we learn a k-means clustering on top of it, which basically produces a sequence of frame level discrete units. We used multiple number of units, 50, 100, and 200 in the paper. And the idea is to see what level of compression is actually going to yield, high quality units. But feel free to ask any question at any time. And I'm also going to stop at sort of some slides to take questions. The decoder is fairly simple. We take Tacotron 2, specifically the implementation from NVIDIA, and we add two simple modifications to it. We add an end of sequence token. So we force the model to predict the end of sequence. And while training, we do random chunking such that we chunk sort of subsequences within the discrete units and take the aligned MEL spectrogram. And this basically forces the model to not take hints from the artifacts in speech, like there could be silences at the beginning or the end of the speech. We take, and for producing, for the vocoder, we take the pre-trained wave flow. There's no modification. And so what we produce is a single speaker speech in this work. The unit language model, again, there's nothing special going on here. It's a what is called transformer large language model in FAIR-seq with 12 layers, 16 heads. I believe it's the hidden dimensions at attention dimensions at 1024. And we take the and we train the language model by discretizing the 6,000 hour subset of LibriLite, which is actually 60,000 hours. The quote unquote better here means that this is just much cleaner speech, which was prepared by looking at phoneme error rate. And this was published as part of another work. Unit duplication, yeah. So this simple thing actually proved to be very useful for us. Since basically these units are at frame level, they might actually span, a particular sound might span more than one unit, and hence we have repetitions here. For Hubert with 100 units, for example, the average duration was 2 frames, which is 20 milliseconds. And this is expected as well, depending on what the frame length is. What we found is that basically the repetitions are not useful for language modeling. This makes sense as a sort of looking back, because the repetitions are just, they contain the information of duration, and which is related to the prosodic information, right? How much stress you might be giving, or how long are you sort of taking to produce a sound. So we found that basically dropping this information is useful for the language modeling. Also, an additional benefit is that now we can train for longer sequences from a training point of view. Okay, so that's pretty much the system. As I said, like pretty much the entire system is built out of exactly same pre-trained models that have been published by other works, or we make some very simple modifications to adjust to our system. I'm going to talk about metrics now. So I'm going to stop here and ask take any questions, or if the system makes sense. Okay. So the metrics at a high level, there are a bunch of metrics going on here. I'll go over them one by one. But mainly, the main takeaway from this slide is that we use a pre-trained ASR and pre-trained language model to produce this metrics. Now, this is a limitation of the metrics, because we are basically trying to evaluate a system using an ASR and a language model, which will require some textual supervision. But we see that whether these metrics actually correlate with human evaluation, and basically think that this can be the basis for future work. The metrics that we use here test at 4 levels, right? We evaluate the quality of the units that we have discovered. We evaluate the resynthesis quality. So this has no unit, this is no language model involved. And then we bring in the language model in the fold. We evaluate the quality of the language model itself without its generation capabilities. And finally, we evaluate its generation capabilities. Let's go over the metrics one by one instead of trying to unpack it in this table. So for unit discovery, we have two metrics. First is ABX. So we basically use exactly the same implementation that was produced by the zero speech challenge. Specifically, there are three sounds, A, B, and X, and A and X are basically same sounds produced by the same speaker. Usually these sounds they just differ by one phoneme. So what we want to evaluate is the quality of a representation by computing if the distance between A and X is smaller than the distance between B and X, which should be the case. And this X can come from the same or different speaker. And we basically compute within speaker and across speaker metrics differently to see if there are speaker variations that can affect the quality. The second metric is bitrate. This is more related to how much compression or how much efficiency we are achieving by discretizing the units. And we want to see how our metrics are actually related to the bitrate of the units. Quite simply, this is basically the bits per second required to encode the stream. And this obviously depends on the number of units. For resynthesis, we have three metrics. First, we use phoneme error rate. This is just to see if the units actually, the speech that we actually produce are producing the right phonemes or not. The sounds actually do make sense or not. And then we use an off-the-shelf ASR model with language model and lexicon for decoding. And we think that this is comparable to human intelligibility due to the usage of the language model for decoding. And character and word error rates are fairly correlated. So in the paper, we actually talk about character error rate for most part. And finally, we have a human metric where we compute the mean opinion score. It's a subjective task between that rates between 1 to 5. The goal of this is to see if these automatic metrics actually compare to the mean opinion score or not. All right, so let's move to the metrics that evaluate the quality of the language model itself. So we use the spoken version of SWUGGY, which contains 5,000 similar sounding pairs of words and non-words, like brick and blick in this example. And we want the language model to score the word higher than the non-word. And the metric is the accuracy of doing so. This was basically proposed in the Zero Speak Challenge 2021. And then we use a related metric with it, which is the spoken version of SBLIMP. It contains, again, pairs of sentences which are syntactically correct and incorrect, but they slightly differ in the sound. So the dogs sleep versus the dog sleep. And we, again, the metric is the accuracy of the language model, being able to score the correct one higher than the incorrect one. Both these metrics were part of the Zero Speak Challenge, and we basically reuse the metric as is. And now we'll talk about the generation metrics. So what we first do is that we convert the unit utterances into waveform and then into English text using the ASR model that I talked about. This is the Wave 2.0 trained on Libri speech, fine-tuned on Libri speech, 1,000 hours. And then we have a system that generates text. Now we basically move the problem to text evaluation, but there are significant challenges to even doing so in the using the textual version of this generated speech. So firstly, we look at perplexity, which is generally sort of a good metric to look at in terms of like text generative models in general. And we just used a pre-trained transformer language model that was trained on USCROL. The problem is that with perplexity, there are two failure modes that we came across, which is only a few low perplexity utterances can be generated by the model because it has seen a lot of them. And for example, this is a real one where almost all LibriVox recordings, or a large portion of them, have this. They start with this. This is a LibriVox recording, blah, blah. And then we also found that the language model can generate utterances which will generate something that means reasonably well in the first few words. Let's say the property by James Russell read for whatever vibrata, but then it will basically just degenerate into repeating the same words again and again, the property, the property, the property. So we have diversity issues within the utterance that was generated and across the utterances that are generated that we want to take care of. So to address the first one, we use CellBlue, which was proposed by Zhu et al. Basically, it takes one utterance from the corpus and treats all the others as reference translations. Translation because Blue is generally treated for used for translation. But we measured, and then we measured the highest similarity and then average over all utterances. As you can tell, basically, since we want to measure the diversity for us to be able to claim that we are generating enough diverse utterances, this metric should be as low as possible. And the corpus here, by the way, are all the utterances that have been generated by the model. So if we generate 20 utterances, then our corpus is 20 utterances. To address the intra-utterance diversity, we basically thought about a very simple metric called AutoBlue. What it does is that it computes a ratio of k grams that have occurred at least once in the utterance divided by the total number of k grams. And we basically take k from 1 through n, which is all the n grams that we can have, and we mean them over and then average over all the utterances. So for a given utterance, we find the geometric mean and then take this metric and then average. And we take these two diversity metrics, and their geometric mean is what we call word, which is just 4 letters from the word diversity. And this is our diversity metrics. And we contrast this with perplexity for the rest of the paper, basically, to see how the model does in terms of perplexity as well as what. Just a simple thing about generation. We have two generation scenarios, unconditional and prompted. In prompted, we use a 3-second prompt from LibriSpeech test team. So, and basically we control the duration of the generated speech. We do not let it actually just keep generating till end of sentence. How do we sample from language model? So we spent some time on this, and we went with temperature sampling, but we could not use one temperature for all systems. And the reason is that this would be dependent on the vocabulary of the language that we are generating for, which will basically affect the denominator in temperature sampling. So how do we actually determine a good temperature for one system? And then how do we determine the temperature for the next system? And how do we contrast it with the two metrics that I talked? How do we get a good temperature that works for both the metrics that we talked about, for medium perplexity as well as word? So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So this blue dot here is the point where you have the word and the medium perplexity for Oracle text. Given the language model. And what we show here is basically a plot of Hubert systems. From left to right, we increase the temperature. And as you can see, the perplexity basically increases quite drastically here. And then beyond this point, it's basically just generating garbage. So this, what we call, is a babble zone, where it will just sound like babbling, and this is just gibberish. This whole area. The point of the plot is to see how basically these two metrics vary as we vary the temperature. So we took this plot and we came up with this metric called area under the curve, which basically means is that we want to be as close as possible to the Oracle text, and there the area under the curve would be 0. So what we find is the Oracle perplexity and compute the word, and then the Oracle word and compute the perplexity there. And then basically this triangle gives us the area under the curve. It's not really a triangle, depends on the sort of the plot that we have, but it sort of looks like a triangle here. And this area under the curve, again, the lower is better. And this is how we attempt to combine the competing metrics, which is median perplexity and word. Yeah. Okay, so far I'm going to stop here because I'm going to sort of change the direction a little bit, because now I'm going to talk about what we do at inference and what our results are. So any questions so far?
I do have a quick one.
Yeah.
Are you using the so you're taking the pre-trained Hubert Wave2Vec 2.0 and so on, and training additional tacotron, and then do you fine tune everything together, or?
No, we don't.
Okay.
We don't fine tune.
Okay.
So it's a strict pipeline where the 3 parts of the system, encoder, language model, and the decoder, they are not connected with each other during training time.
Okay.
There, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, one more thing to keep in mind is that we do not fine tune the encoder models as well, like either Hubert or Wave2Vec or CPC. All we learn is the k-means quantization on top of them. Yeah. Okay, so how do we select the temperature finally? Because we need one temperature. I've talked about, how to get 2 temperatures and, compute the AUC. So what we do is that we take a 3-second prompt from each utterance from the holdout set. The holdout set here is the test clean from def clean from Libri speech. And we sample 10 continuations, measure the blue after passing through ASR, blue compared to the ground truth, and we select the temperature with the highest continuation blue. This is continuation because we are taking a 3-second prompt to continue. And this is what we use as the temperature for all generation following this, and then we take the samples and we send it to human evaluation. For human evaluation, we use this metric called meaningfulness, mean opinion score. Meaningfulness because in the synthesis task, the human evaluation only focuses on intelligibility, but here we actually focus on intelligibility and meaningfulness, which is it generating text which means something, or is it just sort of sequence of English words? And again, this metric here is there to see how the automatic metrics correlate with the human judgment. All right, on to results. So I've already talked about this, the 3 systems that we sort of covered and what vocabularies we have used. Additionally, we use the log-mel filter bank as our baseline, and a state-of-the-art ASR and TTS system as their top line, which goes through text. Okay, ABX. So as expected, log-mel has the worst performance on here. I say as expected because expectedly log-mel has worse representation quality compared to the pre-trained models. Surprisingly, Wave2Vec did not perform very well, and this is a common theme across all the metrics. Generally, CPC and Hubert systems do better, and overall, we'll see that as we increase the number of units, it performs slightly better. Also, the within and across speaker scores for ABX are also highly correlated, so we don't see any kind of discrepancy there. So basically, this means is that the speaker variation does not actually affect the system too much. For language modeling, we use the SWUGGY and SBLIMP, as I talked about. Again, these 2 metrics are also not correlated for all systems. So just for clarification, in the paper, we actually report error rate. Here in this slide, I'm reporting accuracy, so higher the better. So overall, we found that Hubert and CPC, again, are the most competitive ones. And log-mel is fairly competitive to Wave2Vec, which was a little bit surprising for us. Yeah, so here we we see how the area under the curve contrasts with the meaningfulness mean opinion score. We did not conduct the experiment. We did not actually evaluate the log mel baseline for human evaluation because it was like the samples were too bad actually. So it would just completely dominate the entire plot. That's why we leave it out. So the top line is basically very competitive as it would be expected. It's just a UC0. And CPC and Hubert actually again perform very, very well compared to wave-to-vec Durato. And if you see, basically, this is also reflected in the meaningfulness in MMOS, basically, where the ASR plus LM top line dominates, and then CPC and Hubert are competitive. Hubert 200 does the best, which we also see here. And wave-to-vec is the worst of the lot. Okay, so this is another snapshot of the metric. The main goal here is to see if bitrate is if metrics as a function of bitrate actually tells us a story. For most part, what we first of all, what we do here is that we flip the metrics that are higher the better, which is, for example, MOS and MMOS. So we take the negative of it so that they are semantically the same thing. And what we see is that as the basically as the bitrate increases, we are able to actually get better metrics. But there are some exceptions to this. So, for example, if you look at this system here from CPC, first part the word error, it doesn't actually follow the rule. The idea here is, as we'll see in the sort of the next part of the slides, which is we want to see if we can actually take this and motivate how to come up with a very low bitrate codec for speech encoding. And we want to see if these metrics actually give us a good indication of how good this system is, the speech encoding system is in terms of bitrate. This snapshot basically shows the correlation of the metrics. What we want to see is that the zero-shot metrics that we have for the first two are for unit quality. The last two, bottom two, basically are for the language model quality. And we want to see how well they are correlated. So acceptability judgment is the metric, is the task that we use for using the SBLIMP. And with the exception of this metric, see where the metrics are fairly correlated with each other. And this was sort of the motivation in designing the metrics, where we want to be able to see if we can come up with these automatic metrics, which are much cheaper than the human metrics. Okay, so what are interim conclusions? So we basically found out that speech generation can be done in an unsupervised manner without any textual supervision, and we basically claim that this is a new task, which we call generative spoken language modeling. And then we propose a suite of end-to-end metrics, which are very well correlated with human judgments. And we want to further explore whether this kind of setup actually works on more semantic NLP tasks. Okay, so what is missing here? What is missing here is that speech is not just textual content, and what we're trying to do with the language modeling is trying to just produce textual. I keep saying textual, but what I mean is linguistic content, right? So we first focus on the resynthesis task before going into the generation task as our approach. And in the next few slides, we show that I'll show that how we basically took the resynthesis task beyond just producing intelligible speech to more expressive speech. So here are the three main improvements we made in the model and resynthesis model that we have. So first of all, we moved away from the Dagotron 2 model that I talked about. And so we don't need to actually do any kind of MEL spectrogram estimation. And I'll talk about why. And the second thing we do is that we show that we can manipulate the synthesized speech based on the pitch and the speaker information. So we condition speech synthesis not only on the units, but also on the pitch and the speaker information. So this is a snapshot of the model. Let me just unpack it a little bit. So if you remember, basically in the workflow that I talked about, basically the left half of the system is the encoder system, and the right half of the system is the decoder system. And basically this is the resynthesis task. So we have a speech to unit encoder, which is exactly the same that we talked about, except is we use VQVAE instead of wave to vec, because wave to vec had quite limiting performance in the system. And then we have two more encoders. So we use VQVAE to discretize the pitch information, which is basically computed using the fundamental frequency. And then we use an off-the-shelf speaker embedding, speaker embedder, basically. And what we do is that we modify the hi-fi GAN implementation, which is just a vocoder, and we condition it not only on the encoded units, but also on the pitch and the speaker information. And then we basically evaluate it on a few tasks. In the paper, we actually use voice convert. We also show that this voice conversion as a task is useful for evaluating the system. But in the context of spoken language modeling, I'm only going to talk about how we did on the content generation and pitch generation and speaker generation. So GT is just ground truth, and what we observe is basically the system does pretty competitively. All the systems, but especially Hubert and CPC, again, they do pretty competitively on phoneme error rate and word error rate as metrics. For F0, we use voicing decision error and the frame error of the F0, of fundamental frequency, or F0. And here, VQVA actually does better than the others. The main hypothesis here is that we actually did not make any attempt in disentangling the units that are learning any kind of disentangled units from Hubert or CPC. So most likely, basically, pitch information is definitely signal is embedded in the units, and that could be a reason why they do not perform as well as VQVA. And then for basically reconstructing the speaker information, we use only the VCTK system, and again, all the systems perform very competitively, but especially CPC is doing much better. Consistent with the theme of the last paper, we also do a MOS evaluation just to see if these metrics actually correlate very well with the human evaluation or not. And we find that actually they correlate fairly well. So basically, we further conclude that we can actually manipulate speech synthesis by conditioning on the prosodic information in the speech signal, and not just using the discrete units, right? And we have not used any text here at all. And what we find is that basically the pitch and speaker information there is definitely complementary information there compared to the units that we are learning. And this basically leads sort of very well to our third paper, where we ask the question that can we actually now generate speech where we not only generate the content or the linguistic property, but we also generate the pitch and the duration. So just to recap, basically, we made the resynthesis pipeline from just generating content to generating expressive speech. And now we actually are going to modify the unit language model, which was the top arc. And maybe I should just go here, which is the top arc here. And we are going to make this expressive. How are we doing on time? Okay, time. Okay, so what we call this is a multi-stream speech representation, but really we have two things here. We take the raw waveform, we pass it through the encoder and the quantizer as we had seen in the first part, but we also take the pitch extractor, and then we have this frame level pitch that is extracted. And then what we do is that we run length encoding, which is basically we extract the duration information because we have repetitions in the units. And then when there's repetitions, we take the mean of the F0 number that we actually extract. So this is just saying the same thing again. There are two main things here to note, which is for F0, we use speaker mean normalized log F0. This is to sort of smooth over the intra-speaker variations. And for duration token, duration token is just naturally quantized, so we don't have to do anything. Okay, so how do we actually represent prosody? So as we saw in the main diagram, where we take the F0 values and we average them when there are repetitions. But we also do an experiment. We also have another system where we actually quantize the F0 values, and this is just done using binning, which have equal probabilities. This is slightly different from the previous resynthesis paper, where we actually use VQVAE for quantizing the pitch. And what we found is that basically this works equally well, and this is a much simpler way to quantize. The language model, for training the language model, we now add two more losses apart from the original loss, which was on the unit stream. And for when we have discrete valued prosody, what we use is a negative log likelihood. And and when we have continuous, we use mean average error. So since we have two systems, and the reason we are doing this is want to see that does it actually matter whether the prosody is discretized or not? Like, should we introduce that bottleneck or should we not introduce that bottleneck? For sampling, again, when we are using discrete F0, we basically just treat this as sampling from a multinomial distribution. Whereas for continuous, what we do is that we treat this as a mode of a Laplace distribution, and then we do some rounding. The reason we call this truncated is that we basically truncate to a maximum value, and we do not just let it sample any arbitrary value. Okay, so the main changes to the transformer model we make is that we introduce additional two streams. So that would be the D and F streams. And this is what we call multi-stream transformer because we have three inputs here. And what we found is that if we delay the prosodic stream, which is a combination of the pitch and duration units, it leads to better generation and better training properties as well as better generation properties. And the hypothesis is that basically the expression is a good leading indicator of what the content is going to be. For decoder, we use exactly the same setup that I talked about in the previous paper, which is using hi-fi GAN, except that we basically replace, we don't actually do any kind of pitch quantization. We use the pitch that is generated from the encoder, the language model, sorry. Okay, so the metrics. So what we talk about are two things. We measure two things. Can we actually improve the content modeling? So is prosody important in improving the content modeling or predicting the linguistic content of the generated speech? And then can we actually generate consistent and diverse prosody? So can we actually control these things on? There are three main sort of suite of metrics, teacher force metrics. So these metrics are mostly used as a probing metric, whether to see, whether the model actually was trained properly. Then there are generation metrics where we actually evaluate the generated speech, just like in the first paper I talked about, and then human-based evaluation to see if our metrics correlate or not. Okay, so before I move forward, any question? Because about the system that we have for making it more expressive. Okay, so I'll move forward. So for teacher force metrics, we use negative log likelihood on the holdout set as the metric to see if we are actually improving the content modeling by using the prosodic content. And then we use the L1 loss on the prosodic channels to see if they're consistent. Okay, so for generation, what we do is that we use the continuation blue as we used in the first paper, using 20 continuations this time instead of 10. We convert them into off-the-shelf text by using the off-the-shelf ASR that we talked about. We again use the same thing, Wave2Vec 2.0 trained on LibriSpeech 1000 hours. And then we look at the word level blue similarity between the actual continuation and the generated continuation as to evaluate whether we are actually getting good generation properties. So there are two aspects of prosody that we measure: consistency and diversity. For consistency, using the continuation method that I talked about, we compute the L1 loss, the continuation that has been generated by the language model. And we also look at the correlation between the pitch and duration. And this is just to see if the generated language has consistent pitch and duration that it generates, or basically there's no pattern. This is what we want to see. And for diversity, we look at the standard deviation of the generated prosody. Again, the standard deviation is computed on the pitch and duration. And basically, we want to be able to assert that we are generating enough diverse speech, where prosody is also a very key element of it. The human evaluation here, we take basically what we had done in the first paper for evaluating meaningfulness, but we also add two more things, which is how is the quality of the waveform that is produced, since we are actually now producing speech with a different pitch and a different duration, and then how consistent they are. Data and hyperparameters. So these are just some details on how we train the language model. Again, nothing. We just take the same, almost similar settings. In this case, we also actually try out training on LibriSpeech, and that is the only difference with the first paper. Okay, results. So the first one is to see this metric basically shows, are the prosodic inputs useful for content modeling? And what we find is that if you use negative log likelihood as the metric, it does actually decrease the negative log likelihood on the holdout side. MS-TLM, just to recap, is just multi-stream transformer language model, which was trained on Hubert units. That's what it's saying. Prosodic, so we want to see if the prosodic units themselves are predicting future prosodic units. And what we look at is basically the mean average error between the produced duration and the produced pitch. Quantize here just means that did we quantize the pitch or did we not quantize the pitch? What we found is that, so we have basically three systems. The phone units are just used as a baseline, and then we use CPC units and Hubert units. What we find is basically whenever we are using duration and pitch, it actually leads to better prediction of duration and pitch as well. And this is pretty consistent across whether we use phonemes or learned units. For generation, what we see here is that when we are using just the units, this is what it means. We are using only the units, and then we are producing both units, duration, and pitch, and whether we are discretizing or not. And what we found is that basically whenever we use duration and pitch, we actually have better generation properties. And generation properties, as I talked about, is basically computed by looking at the mean average error between the ground truth and what we actually produce, and then the correlation and standard deviation to measure the consistency and the diversity. Okay, subjective evaluation, again, it basically confirms the same observations, where when we actually use duration and pitch, it leads to better quality of speech that's generated, and these are consistently actually higher than the top two. The last two rows are consistently higher than the top two in general. So finally, we conclude that we can actually build a prosody-aware speech generation system, and then we can actually measure them using this automatic suite of metrics, which have pretty good correlation with human metrics. So as future work, basically what we now want to do is move on from language modeling to more semantic NLP tasks. So just to sort of pivot the talk a little bit, we use language modeling as a pseudo or pseudo NLP task, which is a very easy way of sort of evaluating whether there are language properties that can be learned on top of these units or not. And language modeling also is a good task because it's completely unsupervised and we don't need labels for this. However, for one of the practical aspects of this research could be that if we were to be able to actually build systems that could be actually doing semantic tasks based on the learned units, then that would be also very, very useful, because now the amount of textual supervision that is required is that may be reduced. The other good property is that just from a system point of view, we do not need an additional ASR model to basically transcribe the speech anymore, and this could lead to like sort of faster systems. And lastly, generally, whenever there is ASR, there are two things that will happen, which is there will be an error propagation because it's not perfect, and secondly, it will drop like speech signals, which as we talked about, which is like the prosodic information, which could be very useful for tasks like emotion recognition. So that is where sort of this work is headed. That's it from my side.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. Do people have questions?
I can start. So thank you very much. I was almost ready to ask questions during your presentation, but I prefer you to finish. Let's go back to the units. So the so-called speech units. There are candidates in the literature. Perhaps you know this work by Vishnu et al. About temporal decomposition, where he tried, in fact, to model the co-articulation between adjacent frames by some overlapping features. Because I think the problem is the, you know, the key issue is that you somehow you give semantic properties to just a quantization. In the quantizer, you have these co-articulation issues, which is very important for speech. If you want your speech units to approach phonetics, you have to deal with this co-articulation issue. For example, a silence is not a signature of a closure is not a signature of occlusives. The occlusives are recognized by the co-articulation with adjacent sounds. So I think there is something misleading in the fact that you attribute some semantics, so-called units, to something which is somehow very far away from the way we produce language and speech. So are you planning to address this issue? So what about co-articulation? So I was expecting temporal decomposition. I was expecting variable length quantization, where people try to find, in fact, spatio-temporal shapes, patterns, recurring in something called very close to a diphone or whatever. So I think you before going to prosody, and I have also a question on this. I think the way you close how to say, the research on speech units is a bit, how to say, unsatisfactory, at least for me.
Right. I agree with you, actually. There's no disagreement. So we did actually talk about how do we approach the prioritization of the next line of work, right? And the decision we made is that while we know the limitations of the speech units that we are proposing in the first paper, we did find that they work very well in practical scenario, at least in the limited tasks that we evaluated. So the decision was basically to close the loop and seeing if we can basically make this more expressive or not. And yes, to answer your question, we do actually want to address the issue of the units, because we do not really, we have not, or let me put it this way, we have not done any kind of analysis or debugging on exactly what these units capture and what are their main disadvantages, right? So for example, we did not attempt to do any kind of disentanglement when we are learning these units, right? We are just using repetitions as sort of, or as sort of, for example, to remove the duration information. So yes, so that will be the future line of work where we want to be able to actually, go beyond the simple method of constructing these units, actually.
Because I think it's a key issue. If you have quantity languages where you have the opposition between short and long vowels, you are somehow misleading. If you have tonal languages, in fact, the F0 will be completely in your units, because I suspect you are doing Melkeptron or whatever representation. So it's spoiled by F0 anyway, whatever you are doing. So you have in the units, depending on how to say the distribution, the empirical distribution of your data. In fact, the F0, the duration, the spectral information are not disentangled at all. Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. Like, we are not claiming that
so
it's disentangled at all.
It was my initial question about what language did you model?
We do hypothesize that all of these observations only hold true for English. Actually, we cannot claim that this will hold true for any other language, right? Because especially as we go later half of the work, where we are actually trying to tackle prosody, where prosody is quite different in terms of the intonation that appears in different languages. So that's one thing. I would also like to point out one more sort of drawback here, is that even the English data that we deal with is fairly consistent. So it does not have different variations that you would observe in terms of accents, etc. But just to sort of give you a little bit of a glimpse of, I did not talk about it, but we did actually try to train a similar system on English data, but far more casual speech, as well as more accented English. So not just English from United States, but English across the world, and not just so for example, from let's say Australia or India, so where the accents actually vary quite a lot. And this what I like to call a black box system, because we are not picking this apart, as you're saying, right? This black box system still does actually fairly well on the task that we talked about. So anyway, so going back to your point, basically the next step that we want, one of the next steps that we want to address here is that how could we actually address the problem of the units actually capturing not just the content, but also sort of all kinds of information, like the pitch information, duration information, all of these things. So that would be basically the next step in the research. We have not actually done anything on the encoder part. We have pretty much used off-the-shelf encoders so far in all of the things that I talked about.
I implemented the resynthesis paper myself a couple of months ago, and I've been using it for voice conversion experiments, English and other languages, and it's been working extremely well. So I've not written anything up yet, but it's a much more diverse data set that I'm using, similar to what you just mentioned, not just VCTK or something like that, and it's working remarkably well. I don't know whether the clustering to just 100 units is kind of meaning that there's not a lot of pitch entanglement there, or I'm not sure. But it's I find that the pitch has been the disentanglement of pitch has been absolutely fine. It's been easy to do voice conversion where you change the pitch contour independently of the content, no problem at all. So yeah. Do you think these units potentially could be used as targets for a TTS model? So you go phone to unit, discrete unit, rather than phone to Mel spectrogram?
If we were to do that, then basically we would then it would basically mean that we believe that these units are actually capturing not just the linguistic properties, but also all other prosodic properties, right?
Yeah, I mean, you need a kind of fast pitch model where you're also predicting pitch and duration as well as the units, right. I suppose.
My guess, I haven't tried this. My guess would be that you have to if we were to try that experiment, it would be advisable to go beyond 100 units, because 100 units is a very strong bottleneck to be put for this task.
Just for you guys to remember that 30 years ago, Olazi and the Hungarian people have proposed acoustic building units, ABU, for doing speech synthesis. It was the same principle. Okay. So we are back 30 years ago, somehow with new technology, but
nice. Who did you say that was?
It was Olazi, and it's the keywords was acoustic building units. I published a book on speech synthesis 30 years ago, and it's in the book.
Nice. Thanks.
In fact, I have a question, Kushal, concerning prosody. Okay, for somehow unveiling phonemes, syllable or something very alike is a good somehow the good temporal span to somehow to discover patterns, recurring patterns. But for prosody, we expect international units to be much larger than syllables. So if we want, so that's how I read your research, is acoustic building units for somehow building the segmental aspects, and also a quest of prosodic building units to be able also to discover atoms of prosody or recurring patterns of boundary accent, intonation units, and whatever. So I am wrong, or for me it would be interesting to operate at different scales. So to discover the acoustic building units for phonemes at a frame level or several frames, but to have perhaps larger spans for trying to have a lexicon or of prosodic patterns, which are used by speakers to express themselves, to give opinions about what they are saying, and this kind of stuff. So changing the scale of your quantization could be helpful. What do you think?
So I think
suprasegmental and segmental, has some meaning for phonetics.
Right. So I think the practical reason why we actually looked at this frame level prosodic quantization is basically to align the units for the multi-stream transformer. And to your question, like if basically this kind of intonations, etc., they actually span multiple frames, right? And also they might actually span multiple syllables, right? My guess is that the repetitions, since we are actually binning, if you look at the discretization, right? Since we are binning the F0 properties, right? They will be actually binned to either the same bins or close by bins. So the repetitions will basically should be captured in the way we are trying to represent this quantized pitch as well. And duration is basically directly linked to the learned unit. So so basically the duration should also capture like how many times are we actually repeating the units that we learned. So while the prosodic property itself can actually span for much longer duration than the sounds that we are making, if you break them down, the repetitions should be able to actually capture that that the duration is much longer. And basically, from a modeling point of view, we rely on the cross attention to be able to actually exploit this property to learn that that the units could span shorter intervals, but the prosodic information can span longer intervals. Does that make sense? Yeah. So any other question?
I have a more fundamental one, I guess.
Okay.
So I think the entire work is based on the fact that we sort of acknowledge these units are phonetic, so they are at the phone level. And I mean, various experiments have shown that, right? So Hubert units, they correspond well to phones. And so I guess my question is, in what scenario would it be better to use these units than using phones?
So first of all, I think we strive to be at the phone level, but they're not quite at the phone level. Even if you just look at the simple metric bitrate, actually the phonemes do not have a similar bitrate. That's firstly. And secondly, I think it depends on the exact model that we're using. For example, like CPC definitely does not produce phone level representation. It's just 10 milliseconds long. Whereas Hubert and Wave2Wave go a little bit further and at 20 milliseconds. But to your question, like where should we use these units compared to phonemes? I think wherever you have a limitation of generating phonemes, this would be useful, right? If you do have phonemes, right, or for that matter, if you do have textual supervision, we do not claim that this is better than that, right? I would say that like if you have phonemes, by all means, actually you should use that. Yeah, so that's what I would say.
Okay, and maybe just a quick follow-up. So if you think that the units contain, information higher in the linguistic hierarchy, maybe a mix of things, maybe some phonetic, some syllabic, or maybe even with words. But do you think that in this representation, the rate is actually the right one, so we can actually model like what you're doing, like language modeling on top of this? For example,
so are you saying the rate at which the units are produced, are they appropriate for language modeling?
Yeah, so in ideal case, let's say if I'm just giving you a bunch of sequences of phones, and then I can definitely train a language model on top. And if the language model is powerful enough, maybe it can identify words based on the phone sequences. And then maybe it can start to identify, meaning in terms of based on context, not the real meaning in that sense, but meaning based on context and so on. So do you think that this might be possible based on these units? Like learning semantic information?
Yes. So again, so I think, as I said, like one of the directions, next pieces of direction from this is to actually apply this kind of learned quantization on semantic tasks. So a semantic task would be, let's say, intent classification, or let's say we want to do retrieval based on these units, right? Where an incoming piece of query is spoken, and your entire corpus is also spoken, and can you actually retrieve the top K documents given the query? And we found that these units actually work. They are not random, so they do work on this kind of semantic tasks. We haven't actually published this, so still ongoing work, but we did find that they actually work. Interestingly, we also found that they work in the hybrid scenario, where one of your pieces of information could be speech, another could be text. So now you have, in a way, two different languages, right? And they still actually work pretty well. The main crux is that unlike the system that I described here, you have to fine-tune the system to be able to actually exploit those properties. And the hypothesis that we have is that for language modeling, phonemes can actually work very well. However, these units are possibly actually capturing more higher level representation than phonemes. So hence, they actually might beat phonemes for this kind of semantic tasks for sure. But for most of the spoken tasks that I talked about, like sort of the resynthesis or just sort of language generation, phonemes actually work very well as well. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I have this feeling
Okay.
as well. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, cool. Well, it was a pleasure to come here and speak to all of you. Thank you
Yeah,
very much.
it's already a little bit over time. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Kushal, for the great talk. If you have questions, just feel free to reach out. I'm sure Kushal will be very happy to answer all of them. And
yes,
so,
absolutely. Yes, and just as a reminder, I'm not at Facebook anymore, so my email that might have appeared on the first paper will not work. So please reach out to me or reach out to How, who has my email ID, who can share as well.
okay.
If you have questions.
All right.
Okay.
So thank you so much all for coming. I'll see you in another 2 weeks, and we will have another talk. And all right, see you guys.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.